Once again, good afternoon to everyone who has joined us today for our webinar with Dr. Jason Santos, titled Killing Church Softly, Generational and Identity Formation. I am the Reverend Monique Crane-Spells, your Director of Christian Education and Faith Formation for Disciples Home Missions and the National Convocation of the Christian Church. Let me share with you a little bit about our esteemed speaker today. Dr. Jason Brian Santos is an American practical theologian and the pastor of Community Presbyterian Church, a small mountain congregation located in Lake City, Colorado. Y'all, it takes him 55 minutes to go get his groceries. He's committed. He's an ordained teaching elder in the Presbyterian Church. And prior to his call in Lake City, he served as the National Director for Christian Formation for the PCUSA. Listen, he knows what it is to be me. He holds a PhD in practical theology from Princeton Theological Seminary, where he has also earned a Master of Divinity. He's the author of A Community Called Tazé. He currently resides in an almost 150-year-old historic church in Lake City with his wife Shannon and his son Silas. In his spare time, he plays and designs board games. Let us all welcome Dr. Jason Santos to our Disciple space, and all those who are friends of Disciples, welcome into this space. Dr. Santos, you take it away and help us to know what we need to know.
Thank you very much. That was a lovely introduction. I feel very honored. And yes, I do. I live in a 400-person town at 8,700 foot elevation. And that is considered officially the most remote county in the lower 48 states. So we're about 55 miles from the nearest town, which is only 6,000. And I moved here from a traveling job to really, as I was sharing with Nick before this, the idea that I was traveling, teaching people how to raise their children in their faith. And I realized that I wasn't quite always doing that myself because I was always on the road. And so I made a shift. And so, yeah, I am a pastor of a 40-person congregation that swells in the summer. I love it. It's a little reversed. We have 4 months of summertime where we bring in 75% of our income, which allows them to have a full-time pastor at a church. And then the other 8 months of the year, it's really rather dormant. It's kind of like the agrarian society where you work really hard in the summer and you are a little more dormant in the winter. But it's a great rhythm, and it's given me a lot of time to reflect and focus on actually the issue we're going to talk about today. Some of you may be wondering by the title "Killing Church Softly" if I'm a Lauryn Hill fan, and the answer is a big, huge yes. I love Lauryn Hill. And it was the inspiration for this teaching came about really. I started doing it around 2014, 15. I was asked to fill in for someone who was had something to do with intergenerational formation or faith for all ages, and it was something that had actually been seeded in my own thinking way back in during my doctoral work. The idea that there are so many parts of the church that aren't working, and children's ministry, youth ministry, college ministry, and we kind of have to say, what does this mean when we're all divided and we're all doing our own thing and none of it seems to be retaining faith? So it led me to this conversation about intergenerationality that was really sort of just budding around the year. I mean, it's been sort of seeded for decades, but really sort of started coming into a field around 2000, I don't know, sort of early 2000s to the publishing of a book in 2012 called Intergenerational Christian Formation by Holly Allen and Christine Ross. And I loved when the book came out, and have since built strong relationships with those two scholars. And we have wrestled over the years with what all of this means. And there's a larger conversation happening around this. And I will say, before I forget, that in June 13th, I think to 18th, there's something called the Intergenerate Conference that's happening in Nashville. So if what I'm saying and describing for you today really excites you, or you're like, this is something that I want to dig into more, I would highly encourage you to join us at Intergenerate in Nashville the second week in June. It brings people from academia to practitioners from all over the world, from most of the Western world, but from Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, the UK, and they all descend in this little conference in Nashville, and we get to wrestle with what all this means. And so, some of you may be familiar with the term intergenerational, I'm going to give a fuller definition of that. But I want to just sort of ground you, if for those of you who are note takers, just to sort of, I will probably not use a lot of the other terms today, but intergenerational generally means the intersection of two generations. It doesn't have a specificity in terms of how many people are intersecting. It could be two people. It could be a group of people. It could be a whole church that's doing an intergenerational event. But there are, and not just in a average or common way. But let me, before I get too deep into intergenerational, define some of the other terms that are often used in this discussion. One, you might have heard the term cross-generational. There's some ambiguity around that. Some people use that to mean as a sort of synonymous to intergenerational. The generations are crisscrossing. I have somewhat always understood that as two generations crossing where one had a power differential. But one of the terms I've started to use to try to clarify that, which hasn't taken on, so this group here can be the messengers with this coined term, but the term paragenerational. The idea that you have a paralegal or a parachute that helps, and a paralegal helps a lawyer. The idea that there's something coming alongside, and it doesn't have to be an older, more powerful generation coming alongside a younger generation. All that's typically how I would describe children's ministry and youth ministry and college ministry. There's someone more mature, someone more journeyed in their faith comes alongside another generation and journeys with them. That's paragenerational. Multi-generational is a term that would probably describe most of your churches, meaning that you have multiple generations throughout the church, but they are not necessarily intersecting in any sort of way. That's pretty unanimous in how we refer to the term multi-generational. So if someone says multi-generational and it exchanges that for intergenerational, the big difference is multi-generational doesn't require intersection. It just means that they're present. It's what happens at a church potluck. You all go down there, you all get your food, you get what you want, you sit in your own tables. And your parents with kids sit over there, the couples sit over there, the old people sit over there, the young people sit over there, and everyone sort of segregates in that way. And that would be still generations present, but very just in different content and not in an intersection sort of way. Sometimes you might hear the word generational used. Generational is just the acknowledgement that generations do exist. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute as I introduce and talk about intergenerational theory and how that affects our understanding of the church. I think the last, coming back to it, really, there's monogenerational or singular or unigenerational, but we don't use that term. It would just be sort of like age segregated, would be more the term that I would use in terms of what children's ministry and youth ministry and college ministry or any other affinity-based ministries. It's age and stage ministry. It's finding a stage in life or an affinity in life or an age. Often it's divided up by age, and we separate them based on that, and for good reasons. And we'll get into that in a few minutes as well. But the term intergenerational, although it implies and means the intersection of two generations, and I would say in a meaningful way, when we bring that into the Christian realm or the theological world, over the last 10 or 12 years, those of us in this conversation have began to hone this idea of what does it actually mean to be intergenerational, or what does it mean to have intergenerational intersections, and what are the aspects of that we ought to pay attention to. So I'm going to give you 5. And this was developed in 2018 out of what has been known as the Westminster 20. There were 20 folks from around the world who met at Westminster Church in London. And we spent a week together bringing our own context into the conversation. And what emerged from that gathering was 5 terms that really characterize what we mean when all of us have these conversations about intergenerationality. So 5 terms that if you're saying, is this intergenerational? On all 5, but it needs to sort of draw from them. The first one is mutuality. The idea that something is happening to both parties or to all parties. There's a mutual experience. There's a mutual encounter. There's a mutual activity that taps into everyone in all ages. You can get that into a much deeper sense, in a sense of like really, in terms of a spiritual connection or the Holy Spirit's revelation, in that there's a mutuality that exists there. Second one is reciprocity, that there is a give and take, and we recognize that different generations bring different things to the table. A 5-year-old is going to bring something different from a 25-year-old, from a 50-year-old, from a 75-year-old. That's just the nature of life experience and generations. But there needs to be some exchange, some sense of participation where I'm giving and taking, you're giving and taking. Everyone has some aspect of giving and taking. So mutuality and reciprocity. The third is accommodation. We find that intergenerational spaces always are characterized by some sense of accommodation. And we often think, oh, well, the adults are accommodating the youth and the children. We go to the youth ministries, the children's ministry, and we accommodate. I don't necessarily want to watch these goofy movie clips, but I'll sit down and endure it so that for the sake of ministry to happen. But really, oftentimes we forget that it actually, in most of our churches, it's the children doing the accommodation. Churches that we bring them into the sanctuary and we're like, we're going to worship like adults, and you just have to get on with the game. And so there's a sense of, but in any intergenerational formational space, you're going to have some sense of accommodation from some generation. So it's present. Inclusion. And this word is used widely in culture and in a number of different conversations. And we want to use it as well, too, because it's the idea that everyone is included. And I've often said, in terms of the larger race discussion, or even if you want to move that into the LGBTQIA plus discussion about their acceptance or the integration of other cultures within the church, I have often said that if we don't first learn to welcome our own children in the church, how on earth will we ever be able to welcome someone of another culture, of another race, of another language, of another orientation in the church? And so this is, I think, that one of the seeds to finding a place of reconciliation in our churches. The first thing we need to do is look at our own children, who we are invested in and care for, and say, if we can't welcome them into the sanctuary and adapt what we're doing so that they're having some sense of mutual reciprocal experience of spiritual formation, then what hope do we have beyond that? Because we really like our children for the most part. And so that's inclusion. And the last one is equity. And it's not surprising. We mean by that, we don't mean equality. Because there's never going to be equal terms for an older adult and a young child or a teenager. They're never going to operate on equal terms. But that doesn't mean we can't strive for a sense of equity. What does it mean? Are we prioritizing a particular generation in our ministry efforts? Sometimes that's okay. So, for example, I run on Sunday afternoons an intergenerational study of the Bible for youth. And my wife always says, that's a mouthful. No one wants to say that. And I say, well, but it's intergenerational. I want it. And so the parents come and participate in it. It's a study of the Bible. So it's not a Bible study. We're not getting into we're looking at the whole Bible as a document. And it's for youth, meaning I use videos, I use games. We're building with Legos and building the scenes and these things at the end. And so the focus on how I am trying to teach, the methods, the means of that, my pedagogy come out in the form of things that are oriented towards youth. But when I'm teaching, I'm very aware of the fact that there are adults in there, and some of them are hearing this maybe for the first time in their lives as we move through this, and I'm trying to bring them together. So mutuality, reciprocity, accommodation, inclusion, and equity. Those are the terms you need to be aware of. I'm not going to use many of the other generation terms, but that's just what I want you to have sort of a grasp on. I know I shouldn't probably stop and say, do you have any questions right there? But let me just take a quick peek to make sure that everyone's on the same page and clarified. Nope, there's no questions. So we'll talk more about that at the end if you have questions about those categories. What I'd like to do now is taking this concept of intergenerational formation, and I'd like to describe for you why we are in the place where this is now just surfacing. As people say, well, wasn't the church always intergenerational? You look back into ancient Israel, and everyone was present, and it was a very communal. Well, one, that's more cultural than it is sort of intentional, formational. And that's not to say that just because everyone was present, that it is an intergenerational environment. But what I do want to characterize is why we are in this time of change and how this conversation has come about. And I don't think it's come. I mean, I don't think it's come about on its own just because people are like, "Oh, we need a new form of ministry. We need a new paradigm of ministry. What can we do? We've already done all the ages and stages. Let's bring them back together." I don't think it's as arbitrary as that. I think it's actually comes out of a need, and that need is best understood by briefly looking back at the last 4 generations, meaning the silents, the boomers, the Xers, and the millennials, and then I'll touch on Gen Z a little bit. But in order to understand why we're experiencing these changes, I'm going to go from a 50,000-foot level. So right here, we're going to go up here, and we're going to say, I don't know how many of you have read Phyllis Tickle's The Great Emergence or anything written by Christian historians that kind of pinpoint major shifts in the church. But I think Phyllis Tickle does it great. If you're not a church historian or you haven't delved into church history for a while, The Great Emergence by Phyllis Tickle is a phenomenal book in terms of both giving you a primer on how the last 2,000 years has shaped where we are at today, but both just a general, revisit church history. But what she argues is that since the time of Christ, every 500 years, there's been a major shift. So, I'll say my thumb here is Christ. I'm getting the thumbs up from Zoom. It's saying, yeah, I like your thumbs up. But you get Christ, and then you get 300, and things were after Christ, things were not unified. I remember a professor saying once, if only Christians who believe in the Trinity, if you're only a Christian if you believe in the Trinity, how many believe that? And we all knew it was a trap, and some people raised their hands. And he said, well, up to the 3rd century or 4th century, there was no doctrine of the Trinity. So there were loose understandings of baptism, of the Holy Spirit, of the Trinity, of the nature of who Jesus was, both in body and spirit, and the nature of Jesus to the other parts of the Trinity that we now acknowledge and say that. And so there was all this stuff around, sort of floating around. And then Constantine comes along, makes the Roman Empire holy, and then institutes overnight, everyone's Christian. So they start baptizing everyone. That's where we get the palm leaves, and they're just walking in towns and spraying water at everyone. You're baptized, you're all Christians now. Well, this didn't take, not surprisingly. The fall of Rome happens. Everything goes dormant. Everything goes underground. And Gregory the Great comes about in the 6th century and basically says we need to reestablish Christianity as the foundation for the state religion. And he does this through monastic centers, and he does this through implementing Benedictine spirituality. And so monasticism basically rules the roost or shapes spirituality, in particular Benedictine spirituality, for the next almost 500 years. Well, the 11th century comes, there's a great split between the East and the West, and that becomes the Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church. So they didn't call themselves the Roman Catholic Church, but it was just the East and the West. The East was in Constantinople, the West was in Rome. And they split. And then 500 years later, the Protestant Reformation happens. And then you have to split off the Roman Catholic Church, and then it splinters. And now it's like, everyone can make their own religion or their own tradition or their own denomination. And so we are now at a period 500 years later where the end of what Constantine ushered in the 4th century has died. This whole stretch along that entire continuum goes up, and sociologists and of religion and theologians would argue that around 1950s, when the onset of postmodernity set into the Western culture, that we witnessed the beginning or the end, the beginning of the end of Christendom. And we're now unpacking, like, what is all of this imperialistic stuff that we received over the last 1700 years? We're now trying to deal with the baggage of that. Phil Stigl calls it, we're in a rummage sale where we're saying what matters to the church and what doesn't. So in the midst of this, the first thing I just want you, and it's a long way to do it, but it really frames the whole history of the church. We're now at a time of major change, of major trying things out. And so in the midst of all this trying things out that has happened, we also get new emerging forms or paradigms of ministry that we've seen come about in the last century. So let's go back and look real quickly at generational theory. Now, William Strauss and Neil Howe are generational theorists in the late 70s, early 80s. They came out with a book called Generations, and they posited that every life cycle is about every generation is about 18 to 22 years, and every 4 generations put together equals one life cycle or a sacrum. And it's designed to sort of look at the way every 4 generations we start to see cycling characteristics of pushing against. So you have generations that bring about more revolution or change, and some settle into patterns. And so you have this cycle that goes every 80 years. And it's a very interesting subject. I wish we had more time to talk about today, but if just look at Wikipedia for generational theory, and if it says William Strauss and Neil Howe, it'll help you unpack what the more about that. But basically what we're arguing is that they argue that every 20 years you have a new generation, and how those generations perceive something changes the way we think about something. So, and they nuance them into single digits, but I'm going to chunk them just for the sake of everyone's understanding. So when we talk about the silent generation, that goes from the 20s to the 40s. The boomers go from the 40s to the 60s. These are the birth years. The Xers go from 60s to 80s, and the millennials go from the 80s to 2000s, and from the 2000s to our present day, really, you have the Gen Zers. And we are on the verge right now, actually, of another generation after that is coming now. But we're really focusing on the spiritual climate and why intergenerationality is important. In order to understand that, we really just need the silent boomers, Xers, and millennials. So let's briefly take just a characterization of those. Those born. The other thing I should mention is that generational theory tends to focus on or it has some of its definition on something, major life event, major societal event that happens in a generational cohort between roughly the ages of when they're 15 and 25. They're coming of age stories, and that you could extend that to even 30 now. We get the extended adolescence. So sometime between 15 and 30, say. So if you look at the silent generation, it's the Great Depression. If you look at the boomers, it's the sexual revolution and women's rights and racial rights and the war and all sorts of things that happened in the 70s. You have the extra generation that were largely forgotten, and we had the end of we were the end of the Vietnam War, but we sort of experienced the 80s. That was our we had the Gulf War and a few other things. We had AIDS. We had Kurt Cobain and suicide, the glamorization of suicide, and then the Xers, and actually Y2, in the sense of the millennials ultimately had Y2K, this idea that the world was going to end at 2000. So each of us had these sort of changing life events. And what's happening right now to the Gen Zers as they entered into their 20s and 21, 22, my son's in that category, it's COVID. COVID's going to define this generation in a way that we will know 10 years from now. But the silent generation was largely a moral generation. They were the last one that comes out of the war. They were the in-between generation between the two wars. There was the last generation that still saw Christianity and civil citizenship as being equal. If you were a good Christian, you're a good citizen. If you're a good citizen, you're a good Christian. Everyone went to church. People volunteered with their time. There was the Lions Club, the Rotary Club, Masonic Club, things like that, social clubs that brought people together. You give of your time, you vote, not for your own politics, but for the sense of democracy of the whole. We have lived in a much more unified culture. That's not to say it was the greatest time, but it was a time where there was a more unified sense of what the culture was doing. And so they were moral, they were decent. This was the emphasis. Well, they are also the generation that comes after World War II, and they were the ones who gave birth to the boomers. And after 1940s, there was a major shift in our culture in terms of population. We had this gigantic, the largest generations in the history of our country was surfaced. But more importantly, around that time, there was a major shift academically from anthropology, which came about with Margaret Mead in the early part of the 1900s, and then moved to sociology. And there's a lot of sociological studies that surface. And then we quickly moved to a place, and not that those studies aren't still being, those our fields aren't still being contributed to, but we shifted for the first time to a psychological field. And you start to see this in the early 1900s, and you start to see a bubble around the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and this emphasis on the individual as the person, as a person. Who am I as a person? It was very therapeutic. This is ultimately resulted in things like Oprah and Dr. Phil, when self-help books and the whole field of therapy, it comes out of this idea that we can be self-actualized. And so we went from a communal understanding to an individual understanding, and therefore to a therapeutic understanding. And so the boomer generation, largely not surprisingly, were characterized by a sense of sort of self-focused, therapeutic try not to be mean to any of those boomers out there. But let's just say you focused on yourself, and we're suffering the consequences of it now. Hoo-hoo. But and then the late silent generation gave birth, and the early boomers gave birth to the Xers. The Xers were the smallest generation of the four. We were the ones who had the least emphasis. We are also the ones that suffered at the hands of a major shift and change in society, and the shift and change in society wasn't necessarily a bad one, but the rapidity in which it was implemented was challenging, and that is that as women's rights and contraceptions came out, and we had a larger view of people as individuals, women began pursuing careers. And so now we had two income homes. And so it was for the first time, and not that there wasn't two working homes before that, but in society a century before, when both middle-aged parents were working, the grandparents would be living at home taking care of the children, because you didn't have a public school system yet. So now we had a public school system since around the 1920s. The kids were in school, both parents could work. And now we get this whole generation of kids that we call latchkey kids. We went home, we let ourselves in. Yeah, raise your hand for most of your cameras aren't on. But you went home and you were raised. We were the first generation probably with ADD, because we were raised by watching cartoons after school and having Velveeta and watching Scooby-Doo. And so that, we were a generation that raised ourselves. We were left to our own devices. So we had suicide and glamorized by Nirvana. We had the idea of sort of grunge or dark or, sort of gritty, sort of existential angst got cast onto us. They called us the lost generation, the 13th generation. We had this sort of cloud of sort of Eeyore-ish on us. Like from Winnie the Pooh, Eeyore. But so we, and because of that, our parents weren't around. We really, we were left to do whatever we wanted to our own devices. If my children knew half the stuff I did when I was a teenager, I'd be aghast, and they would be thrilled, because it would give them license to do things they shouldn't. So anyway, but then the younger boomer generation gets rise to this millennial generation. This millennial generation comes out after some of that stuff and the extra generations worked out. But really, the millennial generation comes at an age where we start to see the internet, and we start to see a globalization and all of these inputs from around the world, and a greater mobilization in our country. People are moving left and right, and transplants to different cities. And so these kids in the millennial generation are growing up not only with technology, not only with internet, not only with screens, but receiving all the information from that. But they're also growing up in a far more multicultural, ethnic, multi-input society. Now let's run that back through and imagine what's happening in the church. Well, the silent generation were the last generation just to go to church for everyone. They took their kids there. Their kid didn't make a difference whether the kid really wanted to go or not. The kids were coming. You're dragging out of school. You're out of bed and fix your hair, and you're going to go to school. Sunday school was something that was around, but it really sort of started to develop in the 1920s when the religious education movement started. We started saying, you know what, because it parroted or aped some of the convictions of public school education, and if we separate these kids into different ages, we can actually teach them better. And as psychology was contributing to that, you get multiple learning theory, you get age and stage learning theory, you get developmental theory, and all of these things. So, we need to separate our kids if we're going to, catechize them the best we can. And this came about not because we intentionally said, let's just separate them, but because we thought we were doing something good. And so we went from a time where everyone was in church together till when the boom happened, all of a sudden there were way too many people in our churches. We didn't have our mega churches. We had, the largest churches were the downtown churches where there were big cathedrals, smaller suburban churches, and rural churches were tiny. And so they couldn't fit all the people who were coming to church, because we were like, hey, we're not at war anymore. Let's go back and we'll be worshiping people. So that's still remnant of the silent generation, still filtering into the boomers. And so what we did, though, is we said, hey, let's put Sunday school in church, and then we'll hold another service and we'll put church in Sunday school. So we flip-flopped it, and we basically divided our congregations into two. It was around the time that the coffee maker and Starbucks, and really like the very beginning of Starbucks, when they were selling like home coffee makers, and it was the first time this was sort of becoming mainstream in our culture, introduced. And so we had coffee hours. And what happened in that over the course of the boomer and a little bit into the Xer timeline was the boomers figured out that they could just go to church for 1 hour if they went to church, and they sent their kids to Sunday school because it was happening at the same time. So we start to move through this generation where everything is starting to be segregated. And then we're like, oh, in the 70s and 80s, we started seeing youth ministry come about. In the 80s and 90s, we start seeing children's ministry come out and college ministry make a rejuvenation. And all of a sudden, it's like, hey, everyone needs to have these separate age and stage ministries so that we can attract people to our church, because the boomers also caught on to the therapeutic idea that the bigger we build our churches, the more successful we are, then we look like the corporate world, and then we will be perceived as successful and more people want to come in. It was the build it and they will come mentality. So the Xers were the first ones that we experimented on youth ministry with. And that's part of the reason probably why around the year 2000, most Xers were disenchanted with the church. We were the first generation to kind of leave. The boomers like, let's reform it to a mega church, to a non-denominational church, so it has stuff that we like. The Xers are kind of like, we'll stick around. And then we departed for about a decade or more. And then we returned when we were in our early 30s, not because we were interested in spirituality, but interestingly enough, because of that change I mentioned earlier, with women in the workforce. Now, all of a sudden, because more women were being educated, and these are all good things, but there doesn't mean just because there's a good thing that there isn't collateral challenges that come from that. But when you have two working incomes, and you have women pursuing their careers, well, then you have and you have the introduction of contraception and no longer the risk of having a child. What you have is let's get educated. Let's spend some time in our couplehood. That comes from the boomer era of like this idea we need to bond together as a couple. And then it was around the time of 30 when most couples were in some sense of stable relationship. And those traditional indicators of adulthood, like having a stable job, being finished with your education, getting married, having children, were now kicking in. This is why in the sociological field, we say young adulthood lasts up to 35. Because it's sometime between 30 and 35, we're seeing these traditional markers of adulthood, of what it means to be an adult, come to fruition in individuals. So they come to this point, and then they're finally adults, and in the church, we're like, hey, let's separate them out, and that seems to be working. And all the psychology and all the research said, hey, this is what we should be doing. Well, Gen Zers get brought up in this, but then all of a sudden we saw around the year 2000. As Gen Zers were the first, as the millennials were graduating from high school, it would have been around 2000, that they would have been sort of entering into their adulthood. They weren't coming back to church. They started leaving church. And this spawned in the early 2000s a big research project, lots of studies around the idea of emerging adulthood, or extended adolescence, or what is now known as the National Study of Youth and Religion. Christian Smith at North Carolina University, now Notre Dame, did one of the largest studies, longitudinal studies of youth and spirituality in our country, and it took a huge sample and narrowed it down, and has been studying them every 5 years about what's happening with this cohort. And really, he's studying millennial spirituality. And what he found, or what his team found in this millennial spirituality, is the idea of that the predominating religion in America is moral therapeutic deism. And that means that millennials saw the religious institutions as providing morality. They saw them as being therapeutic in the sense of helping them feel better about the challenges of life. And they saw them as deistic, that God is sort of away from us, and God's real, not denying that God's existence, but God doesn't really care about what I do in my everyday life, which ultimately means it's sort of a conflict between the morality that they're getting from their grandparents or from the church that's still embodied in the church, and that sense of deism of God doesn't really care. But what you get in this moral therapeutic deism is the characterization of millennial spirituality. And I want to argue that actually those characteristics can be found in the previous generations. The morality is found in that silent generation. Their grandparents still say, you got to go to church because that's where you learn about God. And that's why the Xers went back to church, to find some sense of moral compass. It's one of the last places where there is a cohesive, articulated understanding of morality, in particular in a day of sacred umbrellas where we all define our own morality. The church becomes one of those last institutions that is really willing to say right or wrong of their perceptions of what that is. They're still willing to make a stand. The therapy part of moral therapeutic deism comes from the boomers. I mean, they are all about themselves and their fulfillment. And this is why, really, I have a book on my shelf called a generation of psychopaths, and it's written about the boomer generation. It's the first generation in hundreds of years that sociologists identify as being more concerned for their own well-being and welfare than they are for the next generations that come after them. Now, they may argue that and say, well, look at all the money I've saved for my millennial kids. But the reality is we are in a worse place in our society environmentally, and this is where you may not agree with me or not. I don't know, but environmentally, societally, like we are at a critical point in our society where everything, where it's a heyday and technologically, and some of the things that we have in our, the capacity to travel, capacity to have information, all these sort of things are new and exciting. We have better food than we've ever had, but there's a cost to all of that. And that cost is a breakdown of some of those things that were in society that brought about some sense of stability. And then the last one is that deistic piece. And that's where the older brothers and sisters come into play. So, and you see that even more so in the Gen Z, and, we as Xers, we came home and our parents weren't there. We had a feeling that our parents were alive. They cared for us. They loved us, but they were never around. And so our projection of God is a distant God that's there, but never really around. And so the millennials are this conglomeration, and that led us to this sort of theory, a number of sociologists build around it, called the patchwork self or the bricolage self. And it's the idea that millennials were the first full-fledged generation that from a very young age, they began to piece together their identity. I'm going to take a bit of this. I'm going to take a bit of that. They were the generation that could be like, you know what, I'm going to go to school tomorrow. I'm going to dress gothy. And the next day I'm going to dress preppy. And the next day I'm going to put on some sports activewear and be sporty. And they could do that. And the fluidity of that, no one questioned. And so the idea that, you go back to the Breakfast Club where we're stereotyping the people who go to high school, we're no longer doing that because you can't stereotype people these days. We're too diverse. We're too, because we've taken multiple identities and we're trying to build who we are from all these different situations. Now, this is the challenge of this. And this is where we get into the intergenerational part. The challenge of this is this. Sociologists say that whenever you grow up with a myriad of identities coming and attaching themselves to you, you kind of grow up with no identity. This is why you have throughout the generations, boomers, Xers, millennials, all of them are saying as adults, I don't know who I am. I can't figure out who I am. Because 100 years ago, your identity was given to you by the community you lived in. And that's just, everyone raised their children the same way. No one's questioning. Everyone had the same expectations of marriage and the same. This is why we have such a high rate of divorce now, is because we're coming from all over the parts of the world and the countries and cultures, and expectations are all different, and we're clashing in those things. Whereas if you're raised in, even now, some small little teeny town in Bavaria, Germany, and you get married to someone from that town, that you already know how you're going to parent because that parenting style has been given to you, and you know how you're going to raise your kid, and your kids will be raised as a little town Bavarian, and that's just who they are. But we now don't live in that society because of globalization. All those things bring all those identities into us. So Peter Berger has a theory. He was a sociologist who died, I don't know, about 10 years ago or so, but he was an Austrian American sociologist. And he makes the argument that there are two types of socialization, primary and secondary. Primary is what happens from birth. What used to go all the way to your teen years probably happens now about 5 or 6, a little earlier just in our culture. But it's the socialization that happens through those who you have emotional connections to. So it starts with your parents and your brothers and sisters. It starts with, and then it goes to your extended family, and then it goes to your church family and your school family, and in a collective culture or in a tighter knit culture, that continues on in those relationships. And so your identity comes from that sense of who you are, and it's anchored. And then theoretically, what happens at some point in your life, you get into the secondary socialization. And this is where you get all these other views that are coming in, and you're trying to adjudicate. How do these bounce off what I've been told, I believe? And the challenge is this is starting younger. This is starting 5 or 6 years old when they get into school, and there are so many different exposures to that. And then they hear, well, Johnny at school is allowed to, slurp his soup at home. Why aren't I allowed to slurp my soup at home? Well, this didn't happen in closed context cultures, but now in a diverse culture, we're having these challenges where 5, 6, 7-year-olds who don't have the intellectual capacity to have executive decision making around whether or not they should follow one path or the other. They just see something new and think, hey, let's give it a go. And so they come home, they start slurping their soup, and mom's like, smack! Well, I can't believe you. No, we wouldn't do that today. What are you doing, slurping your soup? Well, Johnny does it at school. Well, that's the anchored identity is not there in the same way that it was. And the argument that Berger is making is for us to have a sense of who we are in the world and to be able to adjudicate all the different worldviews that are going to be thrown at us, we need an anchored identity. And the identity crisis we're facing right now is because no one in our culture, I mean, even in Christian cultures, the amount of parents I talk to are like, you know what, I'm just going to raise my kid sort of as a good person and hope that someday they'll choose Jesus as the commitment they make and become a Christian. And I just want to have them to have a good time in church. And they expect us just to run youth ministry programs and children's ministry programs to entertain in hopes that the young people just like church and then they'll want to stay there when they come to the age where they can make that decision for themselves. Whereas sociology would say, no, you ought to raise your kid as a children. Horace Bushnell from the last century said we ought to raise our children as Christians and so that they know themselves as nothing else. They have the best success at understanding the world and finding a sense of completion and wholeness if they're operating based on who they are. And this is why I'm half Filipino. And I have a sense of my Filipino-ness because of my father integrated that into me. And that sense of who I am has carried me through my whole life. When you have a sense of who you are as a child, then when you get to that older age and you have to navigate what all those other views are, that's easier to do. So you have this sense of anchored identity that happens in primary socialization, and secondary socialization is supposed to be mediated through that. Now, the other thing we need to want to consider in terms of these age and stage groups are the minute we have our children, we stick them in different age and stage groups, and they're so diverse, and the kids are having all these other views, and they don't understand, and they're trying to figure it out, and they don't have the capacity to understand those things. But as they grow as teenagers, they get into something called situated learning environments, and this happens from the time you're born but it really is accentuated in high school as you're starting to join extracurricular clubs or identify yourself as doing a sport or a theater or art or music or whatever it might be, trying to figure out where you fit into this world. And you start opting into communities. And the idea that it's called situated learning theory. And if I could draw one circle, and then a concentric circle around that, and another one outside of that, you have to think that, and I use the scholars who developed the theory use the idea of AA. And someone who joins AA comes in and they sort of are on the periphery of the community, and they sit and they listen and they watch what people are doing. They see where the coffee is, but they feel like this outsider, like, I don't want to say anything. I don't want to share. I'm just going to sit here in the back like a wallflower. So the meeting goes on, and the next time they go in, they're like, okay, maybe I'll sit in the second row. And, oh, there's the coffee. There's the bathroom. Oh, there's John from last week. They start to feel like, oh, I see what's happening. And then they start to realize, oh, this meeting starts with a certain prayer and ends with a certain prayer, and then there's this period of testimony or sharing, and then there's this period, and then we check in with our sponsors, and over time that participation, they move themselves to the center of that circle, and without even knowing, a year from then, all of a sudden they realize that they are an old timer or belong, and they have a sense of identity and belonging that comes from that group because they have moved and participated in the practices of that community. Now, hold that thought. I have one more theory to throw out at you, and this is what leads us to intergenerationality. Paul Connerton wrote a book called How Society Remembers. He's a memory theorist, and he basically argued that memory communally is formed through bodily action that comes out through performative behavior. And so he uses the Eucharist as sort of a perfect example of that. How do we get a practice that has lasted 2,000 years? And the churches are still doing it today. We do it because it is important, it has value, and it's something that we physically do. You pass the tray and you have to take the cup, and it defines you. And actually, if you look at the words of institutions, the second part of it says, as long as we drink or eat this bread and drink of this cup, we make a proclamation to the world that we're claimed by Christ, or that we belong to Christ. In that sense of the fact that we're doing a practice, we're engaging in a practice week after week or month after month, or however often you all celebrate Eucharist. But through 2,000 years, a society, a culture, a religion of people have carried on this practice and continue to imbue it with meaning. Why? Because the collective memory that gets passed down from generation to generation is critical for the sustenance or the sustaining of religious practices. So when you take all these three concepts, we've lost our anchored identity. We don't have environments often that have defined practices that allow people to enter in and belong, and we are just holding on to the last dregs of whatever Christian practices are there. While we try to introduce all sorts of new ones, we forget that there are ancient ones that have survived and sustained us. Now, how does this affect us when we talk about age and stage ministry? Well, young people are leaving the church in droves. This is the largest exodus we've had in the history of civilization from religious institutions. And I'm bringing it home, Monique. That they're coming home. Why have they left the church? They're leaving church because they don't connect to the practices. Well, one, we've taken them out. We put them over there. We've said, you go do spirituality over there. We call it the one-eared Mickey Mouse, or for the higher brow crowd, I like to call it the Van Gogh Mickey Mouse, because, Van Gogh lost an ear. But we're doing children's ministry and youth ministry and college ministry out here. And as long as we're doing it out here, and they go through children's ministry and youth ministry and college ministry, and then when they're finally in their 20s, we say, hey, join us back in the main body. And they're like, that's not my church. Where's my animal crackers and apple juice? We wonder why young people want to bring a granola bar and a coffee into the sanctuary. Well, because we've been giving them food since they were 4. Eating and spirituality go hand in hand. Why not? So the idea that they participated in their own type of practices out here, and then the practices that define our religious communities, and often the main heart of our worship, the corporate worship, aren't things that really invite them in. And they always remain on the periphery as they go in that concentric circle. They're always out here watching. Those aren't practices that help them belong. But the reality is that if we brought our young people in the church, we had moments of intergenerationality, we had those points of connection, that our young people would be raised in an environment that has been accommodated for them, that we are having a mutual intersection, that we're having reciprocal intersection that allows young people to gather together with children and adults and see these generational things happening, see the Eucharist, sing the praises, sing the hymns. All of these rhythms and practices that define our corporate bodies, the reason we've lost them are because we've taken our young people out of the church. And as we bring them back in and we create environments for intergenerational formation and ministry, we are giving them those practices as a part of their identity, so that as they go out in their 20s and 30s, they may, as the proverb says, when you train up a child in the way he should go, and when they're old, they may depart. They won't depart from it. Well, they may depart from a period, but when they're old, they're going to return to those, because those are patterns that were established in them. So that essentially, in a very short nutshell, I could talk about this for hours, as you probably can guess, is the essence of why we are in a place where we're discussing this intergenerationality, why it's important to have these young people in the church. And if this is something that is remotely connected with you, or you feel like, hey, this sounds like something I really need to dig into, please consider the conference, pick up the Intergenerational Christian Formation book, send me an email, and I'll help you get you on your way. So 1 minute over.
You're all right. You're absolutely all right. It's saturated. I'm a big fan of saturated learning, as opposed to a whole bunch of random tidbits. I really appreciate saturated learning. So I think it's best practice. So thank you, Dr. Santos, for saturated content and a lot to grapple with and a lot of resources to follow up on. There are a couple questions in the chat that I want to share with you very quickly.
Can I say one thing, Monique?
Yeah, go ahead.
If what you heard today is something that you need to revisit again, and you don't want to hear it the same way, there are. If you type in "Killing Church Softly" in Santos, there's a Stone lecture, I think it's called, from Dubuque University, and it's the same content but unpacked in like an hour and some change. Okay, so it'll be a little bit more of a. So
that's really helpful. Okay, so I have a question from Rebecca Littlejohn. She says, would you say that there has been an active rejection of the idea of forcing an identity on our children based on rejecting the identities that we were handed to us among boomers and Xers? And so do you think this is a like a trigger response almost to want them to decide for themselves?
I think so, to some extent, but here's the thing is, identity politics or identity theory are things that have, in the last 5, and I want to even say 10 years, but really in the last 5 years in particular, have exploded. And so when you get into the concept of identity, I both have great sympathy and compassion for the challenges that many in our culture face in terms of the identities they're trying to figure out within themselves. And I think the challenge of that is we have multiple ways to adapt our identity and put our identities together. There are, the genetic predispositions that come with identity. There's the environmental context of the nuclear family that come and impact that. And that at that time, whether we want it or not, and primary identity is being formed. It may be a loose one, but some primary one is being formed. And then there's the development, and when you're exposed to the secondary socialization, that there's far more ways one can express their identity. And the challenge of that, I would argue, in particular with children, is children often don't have the cognitive capacity. Not that we can't take cues and learn and curtail, but they don't have the capacity to identify and define in the same way an adult does. And that's just developmental psychology that are not in the stage where that sort of concrete thinking happens. But what I will say, and I think that what has always driven my thoughts as a theologian, is that in the scriptures, there is a sense of we have an earthly identity, and those are all things that come in. But when, and I'm a Reformed theologian, so I follow people like Karl Barth and Bonhoeffer and those who neo-Reformed theologians who came in and said, when we accept Christ and make a commitment to Christ and accept Christ as the Lord of our lives, we some sense put our own, regardless of what it is, cisgendered, trans, race, all of that is really meant to be put, not tossed out, as you can't deny that it's still there. It all makes about who you are, but that really ought to take a passenger seat to the identity we find in Christ. And the ethics of loving your neighbor and of loving God and of self-giving and of identifying ourselves as spiritual beings are really to reshape that first and foremost how we see ourselves in the world. And that's not denying the fact that in the passenger side now there's all this other stuff that we have to deal with because we're still humans incarnated in this world. But I think sometimes we take what's in the passenger side, or what I'm referring to the passenger side, and allow that to be the defining characteristics of who we are, as opposed to submitting who we are to Christ.
Okay, and she had noted that children do not have the capacity to do that work. They don't have the resources. And I would also add that one of the reasons why we cannot fully, or perhaps have not fully adopted the identity of Christ as our paramount identity, is because we have an incomplete Christology. We have literally forsaken the identity of Jesus for a high Christology.
Yeah, 100%. You should answer the questions. I'm just
no. No. Okay, so I have another question too from our lovely Jennifer Larson. How do we, in response to my quoting you, that we need an anchored identity? Jennifer asked, how do we do that while maintaining room for difference?
Because part of your anchored identity could be the acknowledgement that difference exists. I mean, I don't think we can get away from difference. I'm not saying you take your kids and put them in an isolated cone somewhere and just say, you're going to learn this way, and then you're going to be, I think that the qualities that we ought to be in all of our expression of Christianity, of non-judgment and compassion and mercy and humility, are things that can be part of that anchored identity. I think that's why I emphasize the Christ-centered identity over above all else, because it's the one thing that we can look at and we can kind of agree on. We can say, well, not that there's not variations of it, but if that becomes the defining definition of who we are, then those secondary things are more malleable, and they're going to be anyways. Mm-hmm. But what we really want in the end is, I don't care whether my kid defines himself. I mean, I've raised my kid as a board gamer. You mentioned that earlier, and whether or not he ends up a board gamer or not, I can't control. He did, but that didn't matter. What really mattered was that I wanted him to understand himself as a child of the covenant. And so even now, every night that I pray over him, I say, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May you always know that you're a child of the covenant, because I want that to be his anchored identity. Mm-hmm. Not the fact that he comes from, whatever the particularities of how we've raised him as I'm sort of a crunchy hippie. So I don't really care if he ends up in that direction. It's one of those things that those are the things that are the particularities of life that he can the nuance. But when we raise our kid with a sense of who they are in their faith, and really, hopefully, all the way up to the point where they're either confirmed or baptized as young teenagers or junior hires, that at that point, to have that identity of I am a Christian, And my ethics and my actions and my behavior and my existence in this world is not mediated by the fact of who I am in this, but by Christ.
Mm-hmm. Or by
It may be the only saving hope we have in terms of unifying folks. And I think that's kind of the point. You mentioned that I wrote on the Taizé community, that my dissertation, and I have a book that came out in 2008 called A Community Called Taizé. Mm-hmm. And my studies of that, at any given point in Taizé, for those of you who don't know, Taizé is an ecumenical monastic community in southern France that draws about 100,000 young people a year. And when those 100,000 young people from 30, 40 different countries, from all sorts of orientations, from different, areas of life come together, it doesn't make a difference that I'm, half Filipino American who's a theologian. I'm just someone who's there, who's seeking after God. And not that those things are checked aside. People want to know where you're from, but that's not why we care about. That becomes a point of interest because we're there to be the church. We're there to be heaven on earth. All these, nationalities and ethnicities and languages and orientations and sexes and all those together. And only thing that matters is that we're there to worship God. And so that's why for me, Taizé is a portrait of the kingdom, because we're not being defined by those things that are our earthly existence. We're being defined by our spiritual existence.
Okie dokie. Thank you so much. We have one more question. Would you encourage churches to eliminate children's worship that takes place in a place of real church? I'm not. I would need to.
You mean like it's kind of like a little another version of church?
They would have to explain it. Justin would have to weigh in. Also, would you encourage churches to keep children in the sanctuary during the sermon and the following time instead of sending them away after?
I think there's, I think I understand the question. Across the board, there's no right or wrong way to do this. Okay. I worked in a church where we took them out right before the sermon. After we the reading of the word was from a children's Bible, and we brought them up for the reading of the word, and then they went out and they learned the same passage as they went out, and then came back in when the hymn started. Mm-hmm. Was it the greatest way? I don't know. I think if I had my druthers, I would say, yes, we need to have all of if there is not one space where we as a body, as a corporate, the bride, the collective body of Christ all meet together to participate in the same practices, then we have missed the boat. There is something so critical about the idea for a child that, no, we gather every week and we do these things, and this is who we are. And it's not me going off here and doing my own thing or getting some watered down version of it. But even if I don't understand, and my argument would be that the pastor then should really begin to think, how does the service itself engage all generations? We need a major revolution in our corporate worship to say, what do we need to do to incorporate our children more successfully? And you know what? They're not going to get everything in the sermon, and that's okay. I mean, adults don't get everything in the sermon. Half the adults are sleeping during the sermon, so why not kids too? So the idea is not what they're going to, what did you learn in the sermon last week? Everyone tell me, what did you learn? No one knows. What did you learn last year in the sermon? No one knows. The point is not what you're supposed to learn. The point is not the content. The point is the experience together. It's think about Thanksgiving meal, how different it is when you were a kid and you were put at the kid table that the room extended into the living room because you didn't have enough space, and it's a wobbly card table, and they're just bringing food over to you, and you're just talking amongst your own peers, versus sitting at a giant table with everybody and then saying, let's all share something we're thankful for. Adults, youth, children, everyone is on equal terms. Everyone's at the table together. Everyone has a place.
Well said.
Can I go further with that?
Sure.
Oh, well, I had more to it. I just wrote, if yes, how do you help people make this paradigm shift? I agree with you. So my question is about how to help people make the paradigm shift. For instance, I see parents that don't want to attend a church unless they have children's worship separate from adults. I think that's what we're talking about as a whole. Like,
let me grab two resources real quick. Every year, this is the book, and they just did a revised version of it. So don't get this one, Intergenerational Christian Formation. Get the one that's got like a blue cover. But the last. They've had 3 intergenerational conferences. The first one had a book that came out of the lectures of it. This is the second one. The third one was online. It didn't happen. So the fourth one is happening in June. But the stuff that I shared today is the first chapter of this. And then if you want to know my take on how to actually have how to actually integrate this as a conversation, the first chapter of this is one that I wrote about creating Sabbath communities around the doctrine of Sabbath and how we bring young people in that way. And then I also have a chapter on board gaming and intergenerationality in there. But if you're really looking to get involved in the conversation, I would encourage you to buy these books and start reading them. It's just, there's essays and you can hop around in them and then come out to the conference. If it's something that matters to you, you'll hear about all the cutting edge things that people are trying to integrate this into their church.
Thank you so much, Dr. Santos. Thank you for your wisdom, your insight, and your passion, and your work and your commitment to your family. And may it bear fruit over and over and over again.
Thank you.
Thank y'all for being with us. We will work to try to get the video edited and sent out as soon as possible. If you have any additional questions that you would like for us to pass on to Dr. Santos, we will try to do that. But be encouraged in your ministry, be encouraged by these resources, and just work together. Let's continue to keep hope alive in our work, not just in our thoughts. God bless you all. Talk to you soon, and be on the lookout next month for our fourth Theological Manna webinar, which is Prayer, Uncertainty, and Pastoral Care with Dr. David Cho out of Boston University. Thank you, Dr. Santos. Thank you all. Take care.